The Mystery of BELICENA VILLCA. Second Book. The Letter of BELICENA VILLCA. 36th Day. Starting from the aforementioned concepts, inculcated to Philip IV, by the Dominicanus instructors, he goes establishing the future strategy. First of all, he will have to restore the regal function. For it, he will attempt to separate the Church from the state, and such separation will be based in the precise juridical arguments of the Roman law. But, the participation of the Church was manifested in the three main powers of the state: in the legislative, by the supremacy of the canon law over the civil; the judicial, by the supremacy of the ecclesiastical tribunals to judge every case, independently and over the civil justice; and the administrative, by the absorption of great rents coming from the kingdom, preventing the state to exert any control of them. The measures that Philip IV will adopt to change this last point will be those that will provoke the most violent reaction of the Gallene Church. When Philip IV accesses to the throne, the Church was politically and economically powerful, and was superimposed on the state. His father, Philip III, had implicated the kingdom in a crusade against Aragon, which had already cost a terrible defeat to the French arms. The monarchy was weak before the landowner noblesse. The feudal lords, when they fell to the cultural pact, gave a superlative value to the property of the land, abandoning or forgetting the ancient strategic concept of the occupation that sustained the populations of the Pact of Blood. Therefore, in times of Philip IV, was accepted that an absurd relation existed between the nobility of a lineage and the surface of the lands of their property, in such manner that the lord who had more lands pretended to be more noble and powerful, reaching to dispute the sovereignty to the own king. Before Philip Augustus 1182-1223, for example, the Duke of Guyenne, the Count of Toulouse, or the Duke of Normandy, possessed individually more lands than the reigning house of the Capetians. The King of England, in theory, was vassal of the King of France, but in more than one occasion his territorial dominion converted him in a powerful rival. That was seen clearly during the reign of Henry II, Plantagenet, who, apart of King of England, was also ruler of a great part of France: Normandy, Maine, Anjou, Touraine, Aquitaine, Auvergne, Nice, Saintonge, Angoumois, Marche, Perigord. Only when John Lackland committed the errors that are known, the King Philip Augustus recovered for his house the Normandy, the Anjou, the Maine, the Touraine and the Perigord. However, Louis IX, partner of Edward I, in the Crusade, would return to this English king the French feuds. Since the dismemberment of Charlemagne's empire, and until Philip III, not existed nothing similar to the national consciousness in the kings of France, but an ambition of territorial dominance that aimed to support the feudal power. The nobility was then purely cultural, was founded in the titles of the property, and not in the blood as would correspond to an authentic aristocracy of the spirit. In such manner, that territorial expansions of the predecessors of Philip IV had no other objective than the obtaining of power and prestige in the feudal society. In no way these possessions would have guided to the political unity of France, to the absolute monarchy, to the rational and centralized administration, and the national consciousness. Such results were exclusive consequence of the strategy of Philip IV. But a Hyperborean strategy is not a mere set of measures, but the dynamic structure of an action finally effective. The strategy at Philip IV was based in the next concept of the Hyperborean wisdom. If a population is organized according to the Pact of Blood, then the regal function demands the strategic mode of life. It means that the king of the Pact of Blood shall guide his people, applying the strategic principles of the occupation of the enclosure, and the strategic wall, supplemented with the principle of the magical cultivation, that is to say, with the white Atlantean inheritance of the agriculture and the animal husbandry. To this concept, that I already mentioned in the third day, is necessary to return to comprehend structurally the change in the French policy, after the advent of Philip the Fair. In practical terms, the strategy at Philip IV that he wanted to implement consisted in the execution of the three principles mentioned through three correspondent politic facts. I will explain now, in order, how Philip IV understood such principles related with the regal function, and I will show how his politic acts responded faithfully to the Hyperborean strategy at the Dominicanis. First, occupation of the real space. This principle admits many grades of comprehension. Obviously, in the case of the regal function, the occupation must include essentially the territory of the kingdom. But, who should occupy the lands of the kingdom? The king of blood and the reigning house, in the name of the racial community, that is to say, of the spirit, which is a population of the pact of blood. Because the king is, according to what is said, the voice of the people, their individualized will, the king must occupy the territory of the kingdom, to concentrate the popular sovereignty. The patrimonial feudal system, product of the cultural pact, was undermining against the regal function, because it maintained the king separated from the people. The medieval population, indeed, they owed direct obedience to the territorial lords, and they to the king. And the king could only communicate with the people through the feudal lords. For this reason, Philip IV would sanction a law that obeyed, to all the people of France, to swear fidelity directly to the king, without intermediaries of any type. Nothing material can interpose between the king of the blood and the people. In synthesis, the occupation of the kingdom, by the king, is the sovereignty. Second, apply the principle of enclosure, in the real occupied space. In the most superficial grade of significance, is referred also the territorial area. The own area must be strategically isolated from the enemy dominion through the principle of enclosure. This means that, in every case, the definition of a state frontier. But in this second strategic step, is the one that gives reality to concept of nation. According to the pact of blood, a population, of origin, of common blood and race, organized as sovereign state, and occupying and fencing the lands of its kingdom, constitutes a nation. Inside of the enclosure is the nation, out, the enemy. Nevertheless, such ideal separation can be altered, by divers factors, and is not without struggle, that can be fulfilled the application of the principle of enclosure, and give birth to the nationality. Can occur, as will be seen immediately, that the area of the enclosure exceeds, in certain stratums of the real space, the territorial area, invading the space of other nations. But can also occur, that the exterior enemy enters in the area of the own state and threat the nation internally. This last case is not difficult, due to the cultural nature of the enemy, that's to say, it proceeds from the cultural pact. The exterior enemy is also the interior enemy, because the enemy is the one, and his representatives, in other words, the enemy lacks of nationality or, rather, is international. The enemy not know the principle of enclosure, and not respect any kind of frontiers, due to the whole world for him is his campus belli. And in that field of universal war, where he tries to impose his will, are included the nations, and the populations, the cities and the cloisters, the cultures that give sense to the man, and the fertile field of his soul. It is understood then, that the principle of enclosure is more extensive concept than the suggested at first sight, and that only its exact definition and application allows the discovery of the enemy. The principle is referred, really, a strategic fence, which existence depends only of the will of those, who, apply and sustain it. For this reason the enclosure includes multiple fields, a part of the merely territorial. An area occupied can be effectively fenced, but such geographic area in nothing else than the application of the principle of enclosure is not the strategic enclosure itself. The strategic enclosure never describes a geographic area, neither geometric, but charismatic. This is verified clearly, in the case of a nation that admits many national frontiers are part of the geographics. The territorial limits of Babylon, perhaps were signalized by the rivers Tigris and Euphrates, but the frontiers of the fear that inspired its national army was extended to all the ancient world, and the same principle can be employed to signalize any other aspect of the culture of a nation, which will always present an area of national influence. Only the members of nation know where begin and end its limits. Who are aloof to it could intuit the regions in which the national is manifested, but the precise definition is only known by those who belong to the nation. And this perception, which is neither rational nor irrational, it is said that is charismatic. The Hyperborean wisdom affirms that the principle of the enclosure determines a form and a content. To the form, calls mystic, and to the content, charisma. The members of a nation, on the other hand, are strategic subjects. A nation, as a product of the strategic enclosure, determines its own mystic form, which is perceived charismatically by the strategic subjects that belong to it. Every mystic, the national or any other, is independent of the time and physical space. Its manifestation is purely charismatic. For this reason, all who perceive the mystic, that's to say, who are under the same strategic enclosure, acquire identical knowledge about its form, without difference of perspective. Such unity is possible, because all the strategic subjects have a connection a priori, which is the common origin of the pure blood. Under the form of a mystic, the strategic subjects experience a charismatic connection that unites them in the origin, and reveals them identical truth. It is understood then, the concept of centrality of the mystic. Every strategic subject is the core of the mystic. But, as the perception is charismatic, not temporal nor spatial, it is clear that the same core is simultaneously in all the strategic subjects. In regard to the mystical nation, for example, there is a center that lies simultaneously in all the members of their people, the strategic subjects. Each one of them projects the principle of enclosure in any field, being geographic or cultural, and receives charismatically the national mystic. And the nation is one and the same for all. Now it will be understood better, Dr. Setonal, the charismatic character of the regal function. According to the Hyperborean wisdom, if the core of a mystical nation is embodied in one man, he, undoubtedly, is the king of the pure blood, racial leader, charismatic chief, etc. of the population. The king of the pure blood constitutes then, the fundamental core of the mystic of the kingdom, which is the same center, that resides simultaneously in all his people, in such manner that nothing material can interpose between the king of the blood and the population, because amongst them exists the charismatic connection in the common origin of the pure blood. When applying the principle of the enclosure to his kingdom, Philip IV perceives the mystic of the French nation, and also sees, as for contrast, to the enemy, external and internal. Who is the enemy? It is necessary to consider many grades. In first place, the enemy is anyone who is opposed the establishment of the strategic enclosure, who recognize a national frontier, but not accept it, who put pressure against any of the national frontiers. In this cases, for example, other nation, neighbor or not, but that exerts the unquestionable power to expand its national enclosure, based in the divine right of the spirit to reign over populations racially inferior and to occupy their territory. The polemic will decide the war, the means by which is determined unequivocally what nation possess the best Hyperborean strategy, and, therefore, what is population of purest blood, and who is the more spiritual king of blood. But, this is a worthy enemy, because recognizes the existence of the adversary nation, although not respects the limits of the enclosure. With such enemy, it is always possible to pact an agreement of national coexistence, which doesn't means, of course, the definitive peace, due to us not possible to suspend the charismatic effect of an aristocracy of the pure blood. As in any other nation, will be appearing leaders that will try to resolve the problem. The permanent peace is not conceived in the national strategy of the populations of the Pact of Blood, but a concept absolutely different, known as national mystic, and that will be reached by both populations at the end of the war. The first objective of the national war is not, then, the mere occupation of the enemy territory, neither the imposition of a foreign culture, nor the annihilation of the faced population. All these objectives, placed in first term, obey to the strategic deviations introduced by the priests of the cultural pact. The main objective is the incorporation of the enemy nation to the own national mystic, the charismatic connection between both populations, and the coincidence with the king of the blood. And if that means the destruction of a royal family, the extinction of a voice of the people, the triumphant mystic will be manifested, for all the strategic subjects in struggle, another voice of the people of superior charismatic character, that will express them all. But, in second grade, it must be considered that the enemy doesn't admit even the right to exist to the mystical nations. With this enemy is not possible to conciliations of any type. Of course, that he neither request it, because he never declares the war openly, to which they affirm to repudiate, and prefers to operate in secrecy, from inside of the strategic enclosure. Is proposed in this manner, to corrupt and destroy the charismatic bases of the mystical state, and to cause enfeeblement and eventual disintegration of the mystical form. This enemy, that must be qualified as synarchic, has in every nation, and in all the sectors of the structures of the state, with organizations of indoctrinated agents in the objectives of the cultural pact. Such satanic internationals conspire against the existence of the mystic nation, and, therefore against the application of the principle of the enclosure, and the charismatic connection between the king and the people, that puts the nation out of their control, that's to say, out of the control of the wide fraternity, which encourage, feeds and vivify, the synarchic internationalisms. The plans of the white fraternity, I already explained widely, aims to establish the universal synarchy of the chosen people. For this reason, such internationals would coincide all and to sustain the principles of the cultural pact, directed treacherously to debilitate the Hyperborean strategic principles of the populations of the Pact of Blood, to erase ethic base to the reality of the aristocracy of the spirit, founded over the racial heritage of the symbol of the origin in the populations of pure blood. They affirmed the equality of all men before the Creator Jehovah Satan. To demonstrate that the strategic enclosure, and the nation defined by him, was only a measly idea, elaborated by mediocre men, austere and egoist, who would never accept the high ideal of the universalism, that employed the Christianity as instrument to equate culturally the populations and to condition them to identify a universal principle of the power with the Pope of Rome, who, with no doubt wielded the priestly sword that dominated the temporal swords of the kings. The Pope was a real universal sovereign, who prevailed over the populations and nations. Before his greatness and power, the work of the kings of the blood would have to appear, from the asleep men, evidently unprovided of the mystical character, and the aristocracy of the spirit and the blood, would be, for them fanatic egalitarians, an artificial creation of the nobility, a product of the privileges of the feudal society. And to discredit the war, as means to affirm the national mystic, they were proposing the utopia of the peace, a perpetual peace that would be obtained in every case if the humanity entered in the stage of the religious universalism, if all the secular powers, the temporal swords, kneel before the priestly sword of the Catholic high priest. Then the wars would end and the Christians would live forever in peace, far from the arms and the battlefields, and of the caprice of the lords, committed to the work and the prayer, protected by the absolute justice of the representatives of God and his law. Only one world government would have the power, and yet it might be possible that the two swords would be in hands of an imperial pope, and the peace would bring richness to all, but that richness would be administered fairly and equitably by a unique bank, product of a bank concentration, or financial synarchy, dependent exclusively of the high priest that would exert the universal power. The Christian people, then, shouldn't doubt about who really represented their interests, and to whom they should concede without questioning the universal sovereignty. The occupant of the throne of St. Peter, the promoter of the Universalis Pax, the regent of the Pitchen of Israel. Against this Christian civilization of love and peace, of egalitarian culture, were opposed the national frontiers and the kings of the blood, and the pagan civilization of hate and war, which invariably was produced inside of the mystical enclosures, and the aristocracy of the spirit, and the strategic subjects that was perceived charismatically and knew the limits of the national frontiers. Against them they would fight without declaring the war, subversively, the internal enemy, and external, of the nation, supported by their forces of fifth column, in their international organizations, that aimed, all, to the establishment of the world government and the synarchy of the chosen people. And who was the enemy of the French nation? With the advice of the Dominicanus, Philip IV determines rigorously that identity of the enemy, who was deployed in many tactical organisms. In order of dangerousness, the different lines of action were carried out by the following organizations. First, the Galene Church. Since centuries ago, that the Gauleans controlled the papal elections and, from Rome, they guided the Christian world. Even if the main enemy properly speaking were the Gauleans, they would be opposed to Philip IV, as external enemy through the Pope and as internal enemy through their monastic orders, warrior and financial. Second, the Benedictine Galene orders, the Congregation of Cluny, the Cistercian order, and the Templar order that employed the Kingdom of France headquarter. Third, the chosen people, with their permanent destabilizing and character task. Fourth, the Lombard Bank, property of the Guelph houses, of Italy. Fifth, the English royal house, controlled by the Anglo-Saxon Gauleans, and owner of great feuds in the Kingdom of France. Sixth, some feudal lords vassals, of the King of France, as the Earl of Flanders, who betrayed the king in favor of the English royal house, motivated by commercial and financial interests, to whom were not strange the numerous and rich members of the chosen people, who infected the Flemish and English cities, and by the anti-French influence of the Anglo-Saxon Gauleans. Third, build a strategic wall. It is understandable that Philip IV not reached to comply with the third objective of the strategic way of life due to, if such thing would have occurred, the history of humanity would have taken a totally opposed course and would have not been now, again, in the precedent moments to the settlement of the world government and the synarchy of the chosen people. The application of the principle of enclosure, brilliantly accomplished by Philip the Fair, cost his life in hands of the internal enemy, but it served to signalize the total failure of the plans of the wide fraternity in the age. And the men of stone and Hyperborean pontiffs, who, inside of the Circulus Dominicanus, were awaiting the occasion to suspend the project, due to the lack of initiatic attitudes of the next kings, who plunged the kingdom, already converted in a sovereign nation, in multiple difficulties, which only one of them was the 100 Years' War.